Good afternoon, dear viewers and listeners of the Vox Veritatis channel. Today, in a traditional section of Saturday Historian, we will meet with a historian. The second time in a row, we have a Doctor of Historical Sciences, Mr. Viktor Horobets. Last time we talked about Cossacks in general, and today we will talk about something else. Good afternoon, Mr. Viktor.
Good afternoon, Mr. Vitali. Good afternoon, dear viewers and listeners.
Today, Viktor and I agreed to talk about the Pereyaslav Council of 1654. But I would like to start with a small introduction, if you don't mind. Please explain the historiographical approaches, at least the last 50-70 years prior to the council. And secondly, what position do Russian historians have on this issue?
I would like to make a few words about the methodological nature of the discussion, because we are approaching to a very delicate subject. In the context of war, when the rockets and drones are flying, it is very difficult to talk calmly and academically, but we have agreed that we will talk academically. I mean that I understand, because I am in the same position as our dear listeners. So I apologize if I mention one or the other Tsar, even the most cruel one. I will not swear, but I will try to talk calmly and academically, although I say that it is extremely difficult. If I answer your question about this historiography, Pereyaslav, the historiography of the Union, becoming the subject in 1654, then you can see a very interesting picture. It is wave-like, and these waves are very sharp. They change their direction very rapidly. What you said about the last 70, 80 years, it is very noticeable in that era. When, say, in the 1920s, the transition of Ukraine under the rule of the Tsar was considered, from Marxist position, to be a betrayal of the Ukrainian people, because it was the Ukrainian peasants, the Ukrainian Cossacks, well, mostly peasants, who were oppressed by the Russian landlords, the Russian autocracy. Then, as the Stalinist approaches were established, the situation changed. At first, it was treated as the absolute evil, the establishment of Tsar's rule. Then it was described as the least evil instead. And then it was considered not evil, because these were historical events. And such a sharp turn, of course, can be observed, let's say, by the fact that if we take the 30s, Bogdan Khmelnytsky was presented as a real oppressor of the Ukrainian peasantry, who handed over the peasantry to the peasants under the rule of the Moscow Tsar. When on the Sofisky Maidan, or the square, demonstrations were held on 1st of May, then the monument, which we all know in Kiev, was hung with such great canvas, so that this oppressor was not visible together with the toiling masses. Well, we know that in 1943, Stalin introduced the order of Bogdan Khmelnytsky. It was one of the highest orders. It is a unique case when the inscription on this order was not in Russian, but in Ukrainian. Bogdan Khmelnytsky, like that. Bogdan Khmelnytsky top. This is the only one.
And this is the only national order in the Soviet Union.
Yes, the only national order. And of course, the next wave of historiography change is related to the celebration of the 300th anniversary of the Pereyaslav Council in 1654. When the cities were renamed, Crimea changed its administrative affiliation. A lot of books and documents were published, and in these documents it is clearly neither evil nor anything bad. Not at all. This is now presented as unification. Such a concept is established, which we know well. In the Soviet school, it is like a union, the union of the Ukrainian people with the great brotherly Russian people. The paintings are painted, the famous painting by Mikhailo Khmelko, Forever with Moscow. The art film was made in 1950. Yes, yes, it is a very broad propaganda picture that confirms the ideological perception of this process as a union, and then it stays like that in inertia that lasts until the late 1980s. And if we talk about Ukrainian territories, it is clear that Ukrainian diaspora historians are considering this issue differently. But over here it was presented like that. Moreover, we know that what could be written in Moscow, it could not be written in Kyiv. For example, in the 80s, in Kyiv Library, it was impossible to borrow the history of Ukraine Rus by Mikhailo Hrushevsky. But in Moscow, when we came to the Moscow libraries, you could easily, in the open, find it. On the periphery of the empire, it was, of course, not allowed. And in fact, at the end of the 80s, the last years of what we call perestroika, when Ukrainian historians tried to go beyond and revise these views to understand what it really was. In Moscow, this term of reunification was not rejected, even at the level of academic historiography. And interestingly, about the characteristics of the current state of affairs, views of modern historians a year ago, an interesting book was published in 2023. It is called The Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians. The title is very
Sounds like Putin's article.
It is a word-by-word repetition of Putin's article, but after the colon, there's a word document, and the rest is completely the same. Incredible. I don't remember when the article came out, of course. It was not written by Putin, but he signed it. In 2021, this article came out with such a name, and 2 years later, a solid 1,000 pages of a collection of documents came out. Doctors, professors, academics, 11 people involved in its preparation, who lead the archive management, Russian universities. And the purpose of this collection is to arrange the documents in such a way as to illustrate these theses that were voiced under Putin's signature about the unity of Russians and Ukrainians. Here is a prime example of the Russian historiography, which obviously will not be able to abandon those ideas soon. From the concept of the reunion. Then again, these documents are not just a collection of documents, but after each document there are comments of experts. And what is not quite clear from the text, the experts comment on why it is worth taking into account in the context of the reunion canon.
But this is a return to Imperial Russian historiography, because Soviet historiography recognized the existence of a separate Ukrainian nation, that it joined the Russian one, and the modern Russian one, I think, does not recognize the separateness of the Ukrainian nation, since they emphasize unity.
This is a very interesting topic that we can talk about for hours. We see a phenomenon when the Soviet Union collapses. Different historiographs are formed: Russian, Ukrainian, Moldovan, Belarusian, etc. It was clear that Russian historiography and historians were in a very favorable position compared to others. They had good contacts with all the world's scientific centers. They had good financing and connections due to gas and oil. These contacts create an illusion that Russian historiography is ahead of the historiography of the former National Republic. And they actively implement a new imperial history concept popular in the West. This impressed our foreign colleagues. They try to show the Russian Empire as an empire of possibilities, not only of compulsion. There are many works published in the West by Russia. We know who are heads of the Russian departments in universities there. It is the former immigrants or children of the immigration generation who are from Russia, for whom the Russian Empire is a symbol of the Golden Age. This view is not only established in Russia, but also in the West. They are trying to show Russian Empire in a good light. It is clear that there is very little space for Ukraine here, because only the progressive role of the empire in relation to Ukraine is shown in various aspects.
But as far as I read about this new imperial history, it was an attempt to find a compromise between the enslaved peoples and the people who enslaved them. But modern Russian historiography, which is trying to, excuse me, to copy this new Western approach, does not want to seek some kind of agreement with us. It just does not recognize us under this source.
The first thing that a historian who works on the concept of the new imperial history should do is to recognize the fault of the empire for certain things. And the Russian elite, humanitarian, academic, they just dodge this point. They ignore it. They ignore it. And when we read these very funny things, when the problem of the Ukrainian Cossacks' involvement in the construction of St. Petersburg, then the channels of the Ladoga Channel, where there was a great mortality. Russian historians write that the mortality was big. Yes, but it was not because there were some difficult working conditions, but because there were many taverns, there were many alcohol drinks. Or again, not only Ukrainians died there, but also Russians died there. That's all. But to explain that if Russians died, then it's their problems. But Ukraine is a certain autonomous part whose population is brutally involved in such works, which are absolutely not of national interest or any social interest of the local population. Then this is violent. But this term, violence, is not used anywhere. It is omitted, and it is simply said that this is normal. It happened within the boundaries of the entire empire.
Yes, as Thierry Martin once wrote, the empire of a positive activity. He wrote about the Soviet Union, but I think it was based on this positive activity about the Russian Empire.
Yes, I say that this is very evident in any area. The ban on publishing books of Peter I of the year 1720, well, this is an attempt to introduce some style. This is not violence against Ukrainian language. And so on. That's what can be brought up if you talk about the historiography.
Okay, thank you. And so we return to the Pereyaslav Council. Well, it used to be fashionable. I don't know if it is fashionable now in historical science to talk about the so-called points of bifurcation in history, when from one moment there are possible outcomes in different situations. I understand that we can call this Peryaslav Council a modern point of view, a point of bifurcation. It is clear that Bohdan Khmelnytsky did not think about it. But how far-reaching were the decisions of the Peryaslav Council in 1654 for Ukraine and for Eastern Europe?
Your statement about the point of bifurcation contradicts the Russian Imperial canon, which defines the Pereyaslav Council as a natural stage of the development of the history of the Ukrainian people. I agree with you that this was a point of bifurcation, one of the turning points that could have not happened. Especially when we evaluate the Russian Empire from the perspective of 1815, when the Congress takes place in Vienna, when the Russian Empire defeated Napoleon, and when the Russian Empire establishes the status of a gendarme of Europe. It seems to us that this is a great power to which everyone must strive, everyone must try to enter. But let's look at 1648. This is 14 years after the serious defeat of the Moscow Tsardom in the years of the Smolensk War against the Commonwealth. 14 years in total. What is 14 years?
You're speaking of Truce of Delino.
No, I mean the Treaty of Polyanovka was established as a result of the Smolensk War, as a result of which Smolensk, Siberia, Chernihiv were finally separated from the Moscow Tsardom to the Commonwealth. Here we are talking about the power of the Moscow Tsardom. If we talk about the Truce of Delino of 1618, again, these are the times when the Vasa, King Wladyslaw, claims the Moscow throne, when the Cossacks of Hetman Sagaidakhny assault fortifications in Moscow, and other Cossack regiments reach Novgorod and Pskov. Again, it shows the power of the state at that moment. We should approach things adequately. It's hard, because we have historical knowledge of the later days, and it distorts our view. For Bogdan Khmelnytsky, this alliance with the Moscow Tsar was not the peak of his ambitions. It wasn't the goal of his political struggle. In general, Khmelnytsky had a very broad. It was strange because he had no previous experience in state or diplomatic affairs. But Ludwik Kubel, a famous Polish historian, wrote that there was no day when Bohdan Khmelnytsky did not send his ambassadors or did not accept ambassadors from other countries. The geography of diplomatic relations during the first years of the Bogdan Khmelnytsky uprising is impressive. It is not only about the Ottoman Empire or Crimean Khanate, but also about Transylvania, Moldova, Sweden, the Venice Republic. There are certain facts that testify to the attempt to establish relations with Cromwell, the Lord Protector of England. And in this palette, on the wide playing table of Bohdan Khmelnytsky, there is a Moscow Tsardom card. It cannot be ignored, and here we can even say the exact date when this card appears. On June 8, 1648, Bohdan Khmelnytsky writes a letter to the Moscow Tsar, Alexei Mikhailovich Top. We understand what June 8, 1648 is. The Battle of the Jonkty Vody has happened, the victory for the Cossacks. The Battle of Korsun as well, in May 1648. And the letter, which is well known, it has long been included in the scientific discussion. And again, in this collection which we mentioned, the one about the historical unity of the Russians and Ukrainians. If we look, there is an inscription that this is the first address of Bohdan Khmelnytsky to the Tsar of Moscow with the request for reunification. Indeed, if we read it, we see that Khmelnytsky addressed Alexei Mikhailovich with the proposal that he would become our king. It seemed that the idea is that Khmelnytsky writes about Moscow Tsar expanding his power to Ukraine. But if we carefully read the whole letter, and even more importantly, if we look at the context of writing this letter, we will understand that it is about completely different things. It is about the fact that during these fateful hostilities in Ukraine, these battles at the Jonkty Vody and Korsun, King Vladislav IV dies in Warsaw. And we have already spoken in the last episode about the fact that the Commonwealth is not a dynastic monarchy. It is an electoral monarchy. Therefore, there is a question of choosing a new king. Any nobility, or any group of nobility, could propose their candidate. The Zaporozhian host perceives itself as a part of the Commonwealth, as a knightly estate. Therefore, it is completely legitimately starts looking for a new candidate. And in its search, it stops looking at the Moscow Tsar. Why was this important? Because the Moscow Tsar is an Orthodox Tsar. Of course, if he was to be crowned as a Polish king, he would have to convert to Catholicism. But at any rate, his upbringing, his circle, his relatives were Orthodox, and this guaranteed, so to speak, certain. There was a certain guarantee for the preservation of religious tolerance. The experience of such tolerance, the Cossacks knew about it well, was when Stefan Batory was chosen for the Polish throne. He was a Transylvanian prince, and he was not a Catholic, but a Protestant. When he ascended the throne, he converted to Catholicism, but at the same time he remained quite tolerant to both Protestants and Orthodox, and the Cossacks even called him the Cossack father. And so these are quite obvious things, and these things are clear from the letter. But if we read the comments, it turns out that in Soviet history too, the letter was presented like that, with the first address with a request. But if we look at it in a broader sense and see if it was only about the Moscow Tsar, then no. It will become obvious that Bohdan Khmelnytsky, at the same time as he tried to involve the Moscow Tsar in the election struggle for the throne, he addressed the Transylvanian Prince George with such proposals. He suggested that he or his sons George and Sigismund engage in this struggle. Again, if they succeed in conducting their candidate, this candidate will already be positive about them. Secondly, it will not be a Catholic who was raised in harsh conditions of counter-reformation from childhood. We know that these are the times of counter-reformation. An example of such a presence on the throne of a very staunch Catholic, Sigismund III, was well known to the Cossacks, because these are events related to the church union and the struggle of the polygamy that took place in the 16th and early 17th centuries. And if we talk about the motives of Bohdan Khmelnytsky's approach to the Moscow Tsar, then again, 2 years before the Cossack uprising in 1646, a secret agreement was made between Moscow and Warsaw, that in case of the invasion of the Crimean horde into the Moscow Tsardom, Warsaw would provide assistance to Moscow, and vice versa, in case of the invasion of the Crimean Tatars into the territory of Commonwealth, Moscow would provide assistance. And considering that Bohdan Khmelnytsky's ally is not yet officially the Crimean Khan, Islam Giray, but the ally is the Tugebe of the Peryaslav, who is in vassal dependence on the Crimean Khan. This fact is used by Warsaw to turn to Moscow for military assistance. And Khmelnytsky became aware from the intercepted letters that Moscow had ordered its voivodes in border areas to provide assistance to the Poles. And this is a fact, and there are different interpretations. There are many such facts if you look at it not according to a certain scheme, which was necessarily a regular one, but directly approach the analysis of the situation and analyze certain things. Of course, a certain turning point that impressed Khmelnytsky, which moved the Moscow card to the center, was the meeting at the end of 1648, when he, after the successful campaign, after the victories I mentioned, then the Pilyapsi in September of 1648, then the campaign to Lviv, beyond Lviv, he returns to Kiev. Here near the Golden Gate, where he is met as a victor, as a Ruthenian Moses, and together with everyone else, he is met by the Jerusalem Patriarch Pereyaslav. We know that at that time the Moscow Patriarchy was the youngest, but it had the costs, because it was supported by the Tsar, and it was the Tsar's power, and the spiritual power in the Moscow Tsar was very united, and the Eastern hierarchy used this. Both the Constantinople and the Antioch and the Jerusalem Patriarchs often went to Moscow, and received mostly material assistance, because when it comes to political assistance, to the possibility of Moscow's influence on the Sublime Porte, when we talk about the 16th, the first half of the 17th, it was absolutely unrealistic, because there was no such possibility. It was not the 19th century. And so the Jerusalem Patriarch, he obviously was the first to understand the benefits from breaking Ukraine away from the Commonwealth, so that it becomes a part of the Orthodox world. That is why he, during the Christmas celebration, because it was then celebrated at the end of December of 1648, and not on January 7th. During this anniversary in Sofia, he actually conducts prayer in such a way that it presents Khmelnytsky as a knyaz, and this idea of the knyaz's power, the idea that Khmelnytsky became the ruler of the Orthodox world, and how it could be achieved. Obviously, by supporting contacts, supporting the link with other Orthodox rulers, and with the Moscow Tsar. And it was at the turn of 1648 to 1649 that these contacts with Moscow became more regular, because PZS was included in Khmelnytsky's delegation to Moscow, headed by his envoy, Silyan Mushilovsky. Mushilovsky was a colonel, but the choice of the consul was very symbolic, because his father was a famous church worker, an associate of Job Boretsky, and he was one of the claimants for the position of Metropolitan Bishop of Kiev at the time. His father had close relations with the Moscow Orthodox Church, and that is how Khmelnytsky tries to establish these relations. But again, it was not a one-way street, because Moscow remembered its defeat, a catastrophe in Smolensk, so it was afraid to interfere. Khmelnytsky had to make a lot of efforts to pull Moscow into the war against the Commonwealth, but not only Moscow, but also Transylvanian Principality, Sweden, and, first of all, the Ottoman Empire.
I think the Ottoman Sultan sent a kaftan to Bogdan Khmelnytsky, a firman on subordination, or something like that.
There are evidences, but it is difficult to verify them. There are no documents that would prove it, but yes, there is information that since 1648, well, even the involvement of the Crimean Khanate into the war was direct, massive, consequential. Was it possible without the consent of the Ottoman Porte? Obviously, it was not possible. Therefore, since 1648, and especially since 1649, it is also clear that the Ottoman Empire decided to support Khmelnytsky. To what extent? This is a question that will be constantly raised. Even if we talk about the Pereyaslav Council, it is obvious that the play of the Turkish card is the identification of the fact that Moscow stopped hesitating and declared war on the matters of the Commonwealth. Later, we know that Doroshenko and other hetmans also tried to involve the Ottoman Empire in this war to receive some kind of political support.
What was the status of the Cossack state after the establishment of the treaty? Because we see conflicting views too here, ranging from unification to the establishment of independent state under the Moscow Tsar protectorate.
When we talk about this status, you are right. There was a view on the events of 1654 on January 8, if we are using the old calendar, as if that's it, as if the Cossack state that was being formed ceases to exist, because it became a part of the Moscow Empire. It is obvious that this was not the case and that this was a long process of including Ukraine into the body of the Moscow state, later the Russian Empire. This period lasted for hundreds of years. There was such a dynamic that it was not necessarily straightforward, that with each year the dependence was getting tighter. No, this was instead a process that included the internal forces of the Cossack state and the international situation. If we talk about the Pereyaslav Council, we can talk a lot about the Peryaslav Council itself. There is no reason to talk about the Peryaslav Rada alone. Let's say if we talk about 8 January 1654. When previous agreements were made that Ukraine would be protected by the Tsar, I did not find any document that would mention that it would happen at any council. There are some notes that it will happen on certain articles, on certain contracts. This is a very interesting characteristic, because let's say in the summer of 1651, after the defeat of the Cossacks near Berestechko, the situation was extremely difficult. The Khmelnytsky needed to find a way out of the situation immediately. One of the solutions, alongside the adoption of the protection of the Ottoman Sultan, was to consider the issue of the aid from Moscow. Ivan Vyhovsky, as a general scribe, as a person who leads the foreign policy of Bogdan Khmelnytsky, in a conversation with the ambassador from the Moscow Tsar, who came specifically to clarify the situation, he says that we are ready to accept protection, and I am ready to personally go to Moscow and negotiate on those articles that Ukraine will come to. That is, there was never a talk about an unconditional transition, about plain unification, and becoming a core part of Muscovy as any other. No, the terms were that the Zaporozhian host, this Cossack state, joins under certain conditions with a certain status. This certain status, it was strange in that, as I started talking about the Pereyaslav Council, that it was not discussed at these councils. The idea of calling the council occurred to Khmelnytsky on the evening of the 7th of January. Then the first meeting of the Moscow ambassador Bucharin with Bogdan Khmelnytsky and Ivan Vyhovsky took place, and it was agreed that the next day Bucharin would pass the symbols of power to the vassal ruler, dependent to the Moscow Tsar. And Khmelnytsky said that before that, I want to hold a council. If you understand from the logic of the next day, the idea was to hold a council of Starshina, and in fact, in the morning of the 8th of January, Khmelnytsky called the council, that is, the colonels, General Starshina, maybe also the most influential sotniks, but this is a very limited circle. And on this Starshina council, the idea of calling a wider council is already being raised so that it was louder. And in the morning of January 8th, the decision was made to call the so-called Military General Council. Was this council truly general? Obviously not, because after a difficult campaign, the regiments were disassembled. They came back their homes. In Pereyaslav, there were only the local regiment Cossacks, and there was Starshina, who Khmelnytsky called precisely to discuss this issue of foreign policy. The council was held, and we can talk about the aspects related to the oath, why it happened, the first misunderstandings that appeared on January 8th, which later became a real Damocles' sword, which hung throughout the entire history of the Hetmanate and Moscow relations. Each of them had its own idea of the union, and certain agreements began to be sought after the council on January 9-10. They timidly began to discuss the tentative terms. Discussions started between the Ukrainian embassy headed by Khmelnytsky and the Moscow embassy headed by the Bucharin. But as a result of these talks, on January 9-10, no agreement was signed, and it was only agreed that the Cossacks would formulate their demands. The Hetman government came with its delegation, and this delegation will present its project to the Tsar, and the Tsar will be considered. And in February, in mid-July, a series of senior councils takes place in Korsun, then in Kairin. On February 17, 1654, it was agreed that the agreement will be signed by Khmelnytsky. It considered 23 points. The first to go was the General Senior Ivan Vyhovsky as the head of the Foreign Policy Service of the Hetmanate. But instead they sent another person, the General Senior Bogdanovich Rodny, Colonel Pavel Teteria Moskovsky. And on the basis of this project, from 23 points in Moscow, according to the results of the negotiations, which took place since mid-March until the end of March. They lasted with breaks, and a contract was made, and the contract was put into 11 points instead. I will say right away that there is no original contract now, but there's a draft of it, and this draft gives the images of this agreement. And this draft is completely correlated and can be applied to the character of political relations, which will be after March 1654. That is, it can be said that this was really the contract that regulated the relations in practice. In reality, this can be said with quite high confidence. Why from 23 points? Because often you can hear, even on television, some programs that journalists wrote, that the Cossacks, Hetman Khmelnytsky proposed 23 articles, and in total 11 were approved. And so there were 12 articles thrown away. In fact, it was not so. Why did it happen? The editing took place, and the articles that were repeated, some different aspects, were edited. To talk about the reality of how many articles were changed, we can talk about three main things. Even, let's say, about 2.5 main things. The half in question is Tsar being opposed the proposal of Khmelnytsky to allocate the money for the military service to the Cossacks. The Tsar said that there would be a lot of expenses, considering that the war with the Commonwealth would begin. The treasury would not be able to withstand all this. So it was a setback. But then...
We don't have money, but you hold on.
Yes. There is no money, but hold on. The war will go in its normal course, and we will return to this issue. And two positions that were more principled were that Khmelnytsky proposed that the Zaporozhian host army would preserve this function of foreign political representation. That is, it had the right to foreign relations with other countries, and the hetman was obliged to inform Moscow about the nature of these relations. The Tsar agreed to this first part, but with the clarification that except for relations with the Ottoman Empire and the Commonwealth, which makes sense, considering that, I will say it again, the Tsar went to accept Ukraine under his protection, fearing that Ukraine would go under the rule of the Sultan himself. This is clearly seen because, let's say, in May 1653, the ambassador of the then Turkish Sultan, Mehmed IV, arrived in Chirin, and he brought these attributes of a vassal-dependent ruler, brought the agreement of Mehmed IV to accept Ukraine under his protection, and this was in May 1653. And here is such a strange situation that Ivan Vyhovsky, as if this information was secretly leaked. I think it was a conscious leak to the Tsar's voivodes who were carrying out their duties on the border. This information reaches Moscow on June 20th, 1648, and Khmelnytsky at the same time asked the ambassador of the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman Sultan. The information is known in Moscow on June 20th, and on June 22nd, all the twists and turns that lasted for years when Moscow said that it would look into it later. We will think about it. In a day, the Moscow Tsar gives orders to prepare the troops for the war, and in Ukraine they sent a notice that Tsar is ready to accept them. But let's go back to the 1654 agreement. This restriction was related to foreign policy, and the second restriction was related to financial relations. Because it is clear that when one country comes under the protection of another, it also has to pay for something. And Khmelnytsky proposed that, same way as in the relationship of the Moldovan and Wallachian principalities with the Sultan, that Ukraine is ready to pay for a certain annual fee, which symbolizes the superiority of the nominal power of the Tsar over Ukraine. But the Tsar, having advised the boyars, because in fact each of these points was discussed at the Boyars' Duma, the Tsar, having advised the boyars, decided that the Tsar would immediately collect taxes to the Tsar's treasury. Well, let's say symbolically collect, but these taxes would remain in Ukraine and would go there on demand. But it will all be done as if from the Tsar's treasury. Khmelnytsky did not agree. Going forward, let's say, neither with the first nor the second supplement. And when we see the politics of the Hetman Khmelnytsky from 1654 to 1656, these restrictions were not met, and Khmelnytsky supported relations with the Polish king when it was necessary, and with the Ottoman. The government did not pay taxes from Ukraine, but these were the basic conditions. This is what is called the Bogdan-Khmelnytsky Agreement of 1654. These basic conditions give the basis for the status of political autonomy. That is, nominally, Ukraine is under the protection of the Moscow Tsar, who is nominally considered the supreme power. But in fact, Ukraine absolutely preserves its own administration, its own laws. The presence of the Tsar is nominal. The voivode would stay in Kiev, just to project his power. And that's it, nothing else. And then the further development of the events, this autonomy is transformed into the administrative, and then into social, and then again into administrative. That is, such things are happening throughout the second half of the 17th and 18th centuries.
When you said that Bogdan Khmelnytsky violated the conditions when he addressed both Mehmed and Vladislav IV, I remembered Putin with his crown phrase that they were fooled. It seems that Bogdan Khmelnytsky initiated the tradition of fooling of this Moscow state.
You know, there is an interesting source. In June 1657, when Bohan Khmelnytsky was already seriously ill, and an embassy from Moscow were there. Throughout the first half of 1657, there were 5 embassies. They came back and forth. And in May 1657, Butylin came to Khmelnytsky and made a complaint that they were fooled. And there was indeed a reason to have talks, because the rumor was that at the end of 1657, Moscow Tsar was going to sign the Truce of Vilna with the Commonwealth. He was going to end the war with the Commonwealth, and together with the Poles. The Commonwealth was interested in this. Why? Because the Commonwealth is now going through the deluge era. The Swedish kingdom conquers Polish, Lithuanian cities, and this is a catastrophe. And Russia is reconciling with the Commonwealth and fighting with it together with the Swedish kingdom. But Khmelnytsky is already intensifying his talks with the Swedish kingdom. He believes that Moscow's position is treacherous in relation to Ukraine. Why did Ukraine declare? Why did Ukraine recognize the power of the Tsar? To get rid of the power of the Polish king, and to get all the lands that the Cossacks have not yet been able to fight back. But now this turn, the Truce of Vilna. The Union of year 1654 now loses its sense. And so Khmelnytsky agrees, well, in fact, did not manage to set up formal agreement. But in fact, this agreement is being set up with the Swedish king, Charles. The Cossacks go together with the Swedes and the Transylvanians to fight for the Commonwealth, to conquer Warsaw. And this is at a time when Moscow is an ally of Warsaw. So this is a strange situation. It would seem that Khmelnytsky is under the rule of the Moscow Tsar, but he is conducting an absolutely independent policy. He is fighting against the ally of the Moscow Tsar. And so when Butylin comes to Chiron and expresses all of his complaints, well, not his complaints, but the Tsar's complaints, Then Khmelnytsky says the following phrase, that I did not give instructions. I did not instruct my ambassadors. I did not tell Tataria and Bohdanovich Zarudny to agree to the limitations that were included in the 1654 agreement. And so, given that this was imposed by the Moscow side, I consider myself free from execution. Such was the model of mutual relations. It had a real political background. It was not about the desire to execute, but it was dictated by Ukrainian interests. The interests that the Hetman government had to implement. These interests were in contradiction with the interests of the Russian government.
Understood. How did the Moscow Empire and then the Russian Empire manage to eliminate all these achievements of the Cossack Revolution of the middle 17th century?
This attempt to revise the situation, to strengthen independence from the side of Moscow, to impose new restrictions, has been observed in the last year of Bohdan Khmelnytsky's life. When he dies in summer of 1657, this pressure becomes even more powerful. This pressure provokes the first war between the Hetmanate and the Moscow Tsardom, the one when Hetman Ivan Vyhovsky had to re-establish the alliance with the Crimean Khanate in 1648. The next step was the establishment of the Hadiak Treaty. But due to various reasons and circumstances, which is a very interesting issue, some historians say that the Hadiak Treaty appeared too late. Others say that it appeared a little too early, because there was no good political structure to support it with a powerful military force. The Commonwealth had to fight the Swedes, had to fight Moscow, and therefore there was not enough power. But after the fall of Ivan Vyhovsky starts the first step in the direction of the restriction of the autonomy of the Hetmanate, when Yuri Khmelnytsky comes to power and Moscow manages to impose a new text of the agreement. And again, there is such an interesting story that when the government of Yuri Khmelnytsky comes to power, and when the question arises whether it is necessary to renew the alliance with the Moscow Tsar, he produced his project. It was called the Zerdiv Project, the Zerdiv text, in the city where the Cossack camp was located, the Zerdiv Valley, and it was published. And this Zerdiv project was, in fact, a brilliant one from many points of view, because it considered the body of the 1654 Khmelnytsky Agreement, and probably made such target additions that would have made impossible the conflicts that had already arisen after the rule of Ivan Vyhovsky. Well, but the representative of the Moscow Tsar, Prince Alexei Trubetskoy, in these talks with Yuri Khmelnytsky, declined this project and said that there are many new provisions. Let's approve the previous articles of Khmelnytsky. And what is most interesting, it turned out that these previous articles, which were submitted as previous ones, already had not 11 articles, but 14 new ones. And this is another interesting point, that we said that Bohdan Khmelnytsky did not accept all these additions in the March Agreement, and he did not familiarize his entourage with them in a broad sense. Vyhovsky, of course, knew, but the wider Cossack environment did not know about the restrictions that the Tsar's government introduced. Bohdan Khmelnytsky did everything to prevent this agreement from becoming known in a changed form. And this became the Achilles heel, because this project was already put up in 1659, the agreement of 1659, which, although it was called Bohdan Khmelnytsky's previous article, but in fact it was a falsified version. And this version already had serious restrictions. It banned diplomatic relations. It was banned to start campaigns without permission. It was banned to announce war, to sign truces, these all things that Khmelnytsky.
The voivodes were now present in other cities.
Yes, the voivodes now were introduced to 5 of the most strategically important cities in Ukraine. The voivodes did not yet have administrative power, but it was still the garrisons that were under control. In addition, there were new articles by Yuri Khmelnytsky, and given all this, October 1669, this political autonomy, as we said, became administrative. That is, the laws remain the same old and traditional. The Cossack administration remains traditional. The Tsar does not change anything. But his whole foreign political representation, as well as the approval of important decisions, is taken away by the Russian government. Then, when the era of the ruin begins in Ukraine, the name is not quite correct, of course, but it is known to the general public, so we will call it that. When Hetman was falling apart into the right bank and the left bank, the Moscow Agreement of 1665 was imposed on the left bank Hetman Ivan Brukovetsky. When Brukovetsky was the first to go to Moscow out of hetmans, when he was declared a boyar, married to a Muscovite. But in return for this, a completely different thing was imposed. He spent a month there, trying not to allow it, but at the end of the year, the Moscow Agreement was imposed, or the newly issued Articles, as it was called, in 1665. And by this agreement, the number of voivodes previously present in 5 cities, now there were many more. And most importantly, their status was changed. They now obtained the rights of power over the local population. While the Cossack administration, the Starshina, now had power only over the Cossacks. And when we talk about these realities of 1665, it is already a matter of a state autonomy. That is, Hetman, the Starshina, has power, controls only the Cossacks, as it was in the times of the Commonwealth. But it was a very sharp and swift step towards the limitation of autonomy, incorporating Ukraine in the Moscow Empire. And so we know that in January 1668, the uprising against Moscow erupts in Ukraine. Again, Ivan Brukovetsky, who seemed to be an absolutely pro-Moscow Starshina, who came to power by relying on Moscow, who tried to implement his politics relying to Moscow, but due to such a brutal pressure, he provoked the uprising against Moscow. That is, the parallel between Brukovetsky and Yanukovych does not work, because, unlike Yanukovych, Brukovetsky was aware of his mistake and raised the uprising against the Moscow Tsar. In the end of the war, when Moscow failed to find any serious levers of influence on the Hetmanate, because we know that in June 1668, the Hetmanate was united again under the rule of the only Hetman Petro Doroshenko. But different circumstances, especially the war with the Commonwealth, internal instability, civil wars, lead to the fact that Doroshenko comes back to right bank, and the left bank is forced to recognize the Tsar's power again. But now, understanding mistakes of their steps, understanding their own mistakes, Moscow, when making a new agreement, a deal with Demian Ignatovich, who in the textbooks is called Novorishny for some reason, although it was an offensive nickname. He didn't sign any documents as Demian Novorishny. He always signed as Demian Ignatovich. But the matter is, in 1669, the new agreement was signed in Lukhiv. This new agreement renews the agreement signed with Yuri Khmelnytsky. That is, the rights of administrative autonomy return to the hetman. These rights of administrative autonomy are preserved when Ivan Samoilovich and Ivan Mazepa then came to the hetman's office. They are constantly confirmed. Some points are changed, some points are clarified. But in principle, this body of the agreement is preserved, and we can speak of administrative autonomy. And such a situation is preserved until Peter I begins to build the Russian Empire. And this construction of the Russian Empire causes the transition of Ivan Mazepa to the side of Charles XII. Because again, it cannot be said that Mazeppa was anti-Moscow when he came to power. He understood the political realities. He understood that the union with Peter the First, the possibility of preservation of statehood in Ukraine. But when these imperial reforms put a big question mark on the very existence, then finally this transition takes place. And after that, from the time of Peter the First, such an intense process is going on, replacing the autonomy status with the status of insubordinate territory. But here is a very interesting moment in the sense of the characteristics of the politics of the Moscow rulers. When Peter the First in April 1722 implements instead of hetman, in fact, he was supposed to rule in parallel with the hetman, but as Skoropadsky dies, this becomes an institution instead of hetman, the first Malorussian collegium. So he is arguing for the creation of a Russian state institution in Ukraine with nothing else than the articles of the Khan Melnitsky. Where did the article mention the possibility of this happening? Obviously, it was absolute nonsense, a parallel reality. But the approach itself, when completely, with his manifesto on the founding of the Malorussian Collegium, it is clearly opposite, but it was rhetorically reinforced as if it were in the spirit of the articles of Bogdan Khmelnytsky, like historical unity of the Russians and the Ukrainians.
They wanted it themselves.
Well, yes, that's basically it. Times change, but the methods remain the same. We remember the classic of our Taras Shevchenko, who wrote that the first one who crucified our Ukraine and the second one who ended it. The fact that Peter the First began, his successors could not carry out with such a dynamic and intensity. Therefore, the hetmanate continues its existence for 40 years. But already when Catherine II came to power in 1764, she liquidated both the Hetmanate Institute and in general. She says that everything must be done so neither Ukrainians nor Balts would look. About the Baltic authorities, interestingly, she said, so they would not look like wolves from the forest.
Yes, from the forest.
Yes, not to the forest, but from the forest.
Why was the hetmanate liquidated? What are the reasons? Economic, political, social? And were there any options not to allow it?
If we talk about the Pereyaslav Council from the 1654 year as a certain point of bifurcation, that is, what happened after Peter the Great, entirely follows the concept of imperial logic. Here, for example, there were possible retreats after the death of Peter the First. Catherine the First made some concessions. Then Peter the Second. But the course of the expansion of the Russian Empire, which did not provide for the preservation of certain autonomies, was unambiguous. That course, in the end, it was just a matter of time. Elizaveta Petrovna was married to Alexei Razumovsky. It allowed Ukraine for 16 years to have a hetman form of government and a political life.
Independence playground.
Kirilo Razumovsky thought it was a good sign that it was possible to build a normal estate democracy in the imperial body. But Catherine II said that it was impossible. This was imperial logic. There was no way to jump off this rail. Why was it possible? Again, the imperial government was very good at politics of luring. At first, she appointed her starshina in the position of Cossack. Then she promised them privileges. And Catherine II, we know that at the same time as the liquidation of the Ukrainian Cossack state, she gave the opportunity to the Cossack starshina to move to the state of nobility. And in this way, it was a kind of carrot that she tempted the elite. And the elite did nothing. As wrote the anonymous author of the History of Ruthenians, that the Russian authorities fell onto Ukraine at the time of Catherine II, like dew on a meadow. Everything was so organic, and any resistance, like in past with Ivan Mazepa, or later Pavlo Polobotok, who did it, this was not observed during Catherine's time.
Thank you for your answers. I hope to see you on the third episode as well. Maybe even in a row.
No. I'd rather have a break, so that viewers don't get tired. I will be ready to answer any questions, if there will be any. Let's hope about what our viewers will think about what we talked about. Maybe they will formulate, suggest what is more relevant to them. It is difficult for me to say what is interesting to our general public. I will be glad to meet you, and we will talk more.
Okay, absolutely, I agree. All the best, Mr. Victor.
Thanks. Same to you.